In 1978, the Hollywood industry was riding a wave of unprecedented highs and devastating lows. While Grease and Superman shattered records and filled theater seats nationwide, a different story was unfolding in the shadows. 13 films that year didn't just underperform, they crashed spectacularly, draining studio bank accounts and ending careers. These weren't small indie experiments. These were big-budget productions with major stars that Hollywood bet everything on. Let's dive straight into it and talk about the 13 biggest box office disasters from 1978. Motown Productions believed they'd captured teenage lightning with this high school political comedy featuring a Mike Love soundtrack and Bruno Kirby leading supposed students. The story followed Bobby DeVito engineering an underdog candidate against his ex-girlfriend for student body president. Political intrigue wrapped in California cool, produced for under $2 million. Timing destroyed it. Grease dominated theaters 3 months before Almost Summer's delayed September release. By then, audiences had their fill of high school stories. Worse, most actors playing juniors and seniors were well into their 20s. Lee Purcell was already 30. The disconnect was immediate and fatal. The film stumbled to just $2.6 million at the box office. Universal's multiple delays and regional test markets signaled lack of confidence. While film historians later recognized it as an early template for teen comedies like Fast Times and The Breakfast Club, in 1978, it simply vanished. Frank Pearson arrived with serious credentials, fresh off A Star is Born, and an Oscar for Dog Day Afternoon. Paramount assembled Sterling Hayden, Shelley Winters, Susan Sarandon, Brooke Shields, and Eric Roberts, making his explosive debut. This Romani crime drama followed Dave, the reluctant heir to his grandfather's criminal empire, while his violent father Groffo, played by Judd Hirsch, schemed for power. Roberts earned a Golden Globe nomination for his raw 22-year-old intensity. Hirsch transformed completely from his lovable taxi character into a menacing drunk. Cinematographer Sven Nykvist made it look gorgeous. But Superman owned December 1978, sucking all oxygen from theaters. King of the Gypsies couldn't compete. The Godfather-style saga with Romani culture failed to connect with mainstream audiences. Some performances veered into camp. Shot during New York's legendary 1978 blizzard, those atmospheric winter scenes looked stunning but couldn't translate to ticket sales. The commercial failure essentially ended Pearson's directing career. He wouldn't helm another feature for 12 years. Today, it exists in strange limbo, occasionally rediscovered but largely forgotten. MGM's conspiracy thriller suggested General Patton's fatal 1945 car accident was actually a hit connected to stolen German gold. Director John Hove assembled Sophia Loren, John Cassavetes, George Kennedy as Patton, and Max von Sydow as an assassin. Location shooting across Munich, Bavaria, and Switzerland cost millions. Brass Target opened December 22, 1978, making just $354,000 opening weekend. The domestic gross crawled to $5 million total. Vincent Canby called it a film full of dubiety. The conspiracy theory felt wobbly and audiences stayed away. The failure had devastating consequences. Finishing $5 million in the red, industry insiders cited it as a key factor in MGM selling their entire movie-making division. Think about that. One film helped dismantle a legendary studio. Loren was window dressing despite top billing. Even Cassavetes' intensity couldn't save the muddled plot. Today, it exists only for conspiracy buffs. Forgettably mediocre rather than memorably bad. William Friedkin had directed The French Connection and The Exorcist. When he signed on for the Brink's job, a caper comedy about the infamous 1950 Boston armored car robbery, expectations ran high. Universal gave him Peter Falk, Peter Boyle, and Warren Oates. The material was inherently interesting. 11 thieves pulled off America's biggest armed robbery, stealing over $2 million. Friedkin chose comedy over tension, confusing audiences expecting something grittier. The tone wobbled between slapstick and serious. Despite recognizable character actors and a director with serious pedigree, audiences didn't show up. The Brink's job made less than $4 million, disappearing almost immediately. Today, nobody remembers it exists except when studying Friedkin's career as one of his lesser works. Harold Robbins' best-selling novel about power, corruption, and intrigue in the automobile industry seemed like perfect source material for a sweeping melodrama. Allied artists assembled an impressive cast: Laurence Olivier, Robert Duvall, Catherine Ross, Tommy Lee Jones, and Jane Alexander. The story jumped between generations following an elderly auto mogul's attempts to build a revolutionary new car while navigating family betrayals and corporate sabotage. Production values were lavish, with the sprawling narrative structure meant to echo the multi-generational sagas that television audiences were eating up. Instead, the Betsy crashed harder than a prototype in a safety test. Critics savaged it mercilessly. The script was criticized as overwrought and ridiculous, turning potentially interesting characters into soap opera cliches. Even Olivier, one of the greatest actors of his generation, couldn't elevate the material. His performance as the elderly mogul felt phoned in, as if he knew he was trapped in a sinking ship. Released in February 1978, it vanished from cultural memory almost immediately, making some money, but nowhere near enough to justify its budget and star salaries. Today, it's a footnote everyone involved would rather forget, but can't erase from their filmographies. Richard Dreyfuss was riding high after Jaws and Close Encounters of the Third Kind made him one of Hollywood's biggest stars. The Big Fix reunited him with director Jeremy Kagan for this quirky detective mystery based on Roger L. Simon's novel. Dreyfuss played Moses Wine, a 60s radical turned private investigator who gets pulled into a conspiracy involving a gubernatorial campaign. The film was smart, politically aware, and genuinely funny in places. Critics appreciated what Kagan and Dreyfuss were attempting. The movie had that distinctive 70s New Hollywood sensibility, character-driven, politically conscious, willing to be messy, and complicated. It was the kind of film that would later be cited as underrated and ahead of its time. But in 1978, audiences wanting to see Dreyfuss in a detective story stayed home in massive numbers. The Big Fix made less than $10 million domestically, a catastrophic result given Dreyfuss's star power and the positive critical response. Universal Pictures had positioned it as a potential franchise starter, hoping Moses Wine could become a recurring character. Instead, it became a one-off curiosity that disappeared from theaters quickly. The failure demonstrated a harsh truth about the late 70s box office. Being good wasn't enough. The Big Fix was too quirky for mainstream audiences expecting a traditional mystery, too political for those wanting escapism, and too small-scale for those seeking spectacle. It fell through every possible crack, becoming a commercial disaster despite being a genuinely solid film. Today, it's championed by a small group of devoted fans who discovered it years later. But in 1978, it was just another expensive mistake that never found its audience. The Guns of Navarone was a massive hit in 1961, one of those quintessential men-on-a-mission war films that defined an era. 17 years later, somebody decided a sequel was a good idea. Force 10 from Navarone assembled an interesting cast. Harrison Ford, fresh off Star Wars, Robert Shaw in one of his final roles before his untimely passing, Edward Fox, and Franco Nero. The plot sent Allied commandos on another impossible World War II mission, this time to blow up a strategically important bridge in Yugoslavia. The problems were obvious from the start. Guy Hamilton directed competently, but without distinction. The script rehashed familiar war movie beats without adding anything new or exciting. Most critically, the film lacked the original's star power and epic scope. Gregory Peck and David Niven weren't coming back, and while Ford was ascending to superstardom, he couldn't carry the entire production on his own shoulders. American International Pictures released Force 10 in December 1978, where it got lost in the holiday crush. Superman dominated that season, and audiences had no interest in a belated sequel to a nearly two-decade-old film. The movie made about $6 million domestically, nowhere near enough to justify its production and marketing costs. By 1978, war films were no longer the reliable box office draw they'd been in the 60s. Audiences had moved on, and this dated, unnecessary follow-up reminded everyone why. Today, Force 10 from Navarone exemplifies a particular type of flop. The sequel nobody wanted that arrived years too late. Even casual film fans who know the Guns of Navarone have no idea this sequel exists. It's the kind of failure so complete that it's been erased from popular memory. What possessed anyone to think pairing Lily Tomlin and John Travolta in a romantic drama was a good idea? Moment by Moment stands as one of 1978's most baffling disasters, a film so misconceived from the ground up that its failure seems almost inevitable in retrospect. Jane Wagner wrote and directed this story of Trisha, a wealthy Malibu resident going through a separation, who begins an affair with a younger man named Strip, played by Travolta. Universal Pictures rushed this into production, trying to capitalize on Travolta's nuclear-level fame from Saturday Night Fever and Grease. They assumed his box office heat would translate to any project. They were catastrophically wrong. The age difference between Tomlin and Travolta created deeply uncomfortable viewing. The chemistry was non-existent. Wagner's direction was leaden, treating what should have been a light character study like ponderous high art. The film opened in December 1978 to reviews that ranged from bemused to openly hostile. Audiences rejected it completely. Moment by Moment made approximately $11 million against an $8 million budget, a loss once marketing costs were factored in. But the financial failure was almost beside the point. The real damage was to reputations. Travolta's unstoppable momentum hit a wall. Tomlin's credibility as a serious actress took a hit. Within film history circles, Moment by Moment is infamous as a textbook example of miscasting and miscalculation. It's studied as a cautionary tale about chasing trends without understanding why those trends work. The movie isn't entertainingly bad or fascinatingly flawed. It's just awkward and uncomfortable from start to finish, a mistake that should never have made it past the pitch meeting. Universal had hoped to ride Travolta's coattails to easy profits. Instead, they got a disaster that reminded everyone that star power alone can't overcome fundamentally flawed material. Irwin Allen, the master of disaster films in the 70s, finally went too far. The Swarm attempted to terrify audiences with killer bees attacking Texas. Yes, bees. Not earthquakes, not towering infernos, not sinking ships, bees. Allen assembled arguably the most impressive cast of his disaster film career. Michael Caine, Catherine Ross, Richard Widmark, Richard Chamberlain, Olivia de Havilland, Ben Johnson, Lee Grant, Jose Ferrer, Patty Duke, Slim Pickens, and Henry Fonda. All this extraordinary talent wasted swatting at imaginary insects. Warner Brothers gave Allen a massive budget to realize his bee-filled vision. The production involved elaborate special effects, massive sets, and complicated action sequences showing swarms overwhelming buildings and vehicles. Allen took the premise completely seriously, treating killer bees as an apocalyptic threat on par with earthquakes or asteroids. The problem was that nobody else could take it seriously. Audiences and test screenings reportedly laughed at scenes meant to generate pure terror. The film opened in July 1978 and got absolutely destroyed. Critics mocked it mercilessly. Roger Ebert called it simply awful. The bees looked fake, the human drama felt perfunctory, and the entire enterprise reeked of a disaster movie formula that audiences had grown tired of. By 1978, the novelty of star-studded catastrophe films had completely worn off. The Swarm made only about $10 million domestically against its $21 million budget, representing a catastrophic financial loss. The failure of The Swarm effectively ended Irwin Allen's disaster movie dominance. The genre that had made him wealthy and famous throughout the 70s died with his killer bees. The film has since developed a small cult following among bad movie enthusiasts who appreciate its unintentional comedy, but most film fans today have never heard of it. The Swarm represents the precise moment when Hollywood finally recognized that disaster movie fatigue had set in and audiences needed something completely new. Here's where things get interesting. Terrence Malick's Days of Heaven is now widely considered one of the greatest films of the 1970s, a visual masterpiece that revolutionized cinematography. But in 1978, audiences had no interest in this meditative, slow-moving period drama about migrant workers in the Texas Panhandle. The film starred Richard Gere, Brooke Adams, Sam Shepard, and Linda Manz. Cinematographer Nestor Almendros shot almost exclusively during the magic hour, creating some of the most beautiful images ever captured. Malick spent years editing, obsessively crafting every frame. The story followed a love triangle told with minimal dialogue and maximum visual poetry. It was art cinema at its finest, and it was commercial poison. Days of Heaven made less than $3.5 million in its initial release. The pacing was too slow. The narrative was elliptical and dreamlike. Theaters pulled it quickly. Malick's perfectionism had pushed the budget higher than anticipated. The financial loss was substantial. The irony is that Days of Heaven won the Oscar for Best Cinematography and gradually built a reputation as a masterpiece. Critics eventually recognized what Malick accomplished, and film schools taught it as an example of visual storytelling at its finest. But that appreciation came too late. Sometimes great art is financially disastrous, and Days of Heaven proved that truth more clearly than almost any other film of the decade. Ralph Bakshi's animated Tolkien adaptation arrived with massive expectations and left audiences confused. United Artists greenlit this ambitious project, hoping to capitalize on fantasy's growing popularity. Bakshi used rotoscoping, where animators traced live-action footage, creating a distinctive but polarizing visual style. The film covered roughly the first half of Tolkien's story, ending abruptly as Frodo and Sam approach Mordor. The production faced challenges from the start. Bakshi clashed with the studio over budget and control. The rotoscoping technique produced mixed results. Most problematically, marketing never made clear this was only part of the story. Many viewers left theaters confused about why the plot didn't resolve. The Lord of the Rings received mixed reviews. Tolkien purists objected to changes. General audiences found it too complex and incomplete. The film made approximately $30 million domestically, which sounds respectable until you factor in substantial production and marketing costs. United Artists wanted a massive hit to justify sequels. Instead, they got a financial disappointment that killed plans for completing the story. Peter Jackson's trilogy overshadowed it completely, relegating Bakshi's version to footnote status. Yet it maintains a cult following among animation enthusiasts. The rotoscoping technique influenced later films, even if mainstream success eluded this production. In 1978, though, it was just another expensive gamble that didn't pay off. Universal and producer Robert Stigwood thought they'd created something magical, a jukebox musical built around Beatles songs, starring the Bee Gees and Peter Frampton at the height of their fame. Instead, they created one of the most notorious embarrassments in movie musical history. The film had no dialogue, just Beatles songs performed by the cast. The plot followed Billy Shears and the Henderson brothers saving their hometown from evil forces. George Burns narrated. Steve Martin, Earth, Wind & Fire, Aerosmith, Alice Cooper, and dozens of musicians showed up for cameos. The whole thing felt less like coherent narrative and more like an extended fever dream. Critics destroyed Sgt. Pepper's when it opened in July 1978. Rolling Stone called it a disaster. The Boston Globe said it was one of the year's worst films. Beatles fans felt betrayed. The Bee Gees' popularity couldn't overcome the fundamental awfulness. Peter Frampton, who'd released one of the biggest-selling live albums ever just 2 years earlier, saw his career permanently damaged. The film made roughly $20 million against a production budget that reportedly reached $18 million. Once marketing was factored in, it was a clear loss. But the financial damage was almost secondary to the reputational devastation. Today, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band is remembered as a cautionary tale about ego, excess, and misunderstanding source material. It's genuinely awful in ways that must be seen to be believed. The biggest box office disaster of 1978 wasn't small or unknown. The Wiz was a massive, star-studded production that Universal and Motown believed would be an unstoppable blockbuster. The Broadway musical had won 7 Tony Awards. Now they'd transform it into a film spectacular featuring Diana Ross as Dorothy, Michael Jackson as the Scarecrow, Richard Pryor as the Wiz, and Lena Horne as Glinda. Sidney Lumet, one of Hollywood's most respected directors, was behind the camera. The budget ballooned to between $22 and $24 million, making it the most expensive movie musical ever made. The production was ambitious beyond belief. They shot on location across New York City, transforming the World Trade Center's Twin Towers into the Emerald City, Coney Island's Cyclone into the Tin Man's Introduction, and the New York State Pavilion into Munchkinland. Quincy Jones supervised the music, assembling a soundtrack mixing Charlie Small's Broadway score with new material from Luther Vandross and other top talents. The choreography was elaborate, the costumes stunning, and the set design unlike anything audiences had seen. Then came the problems. Diana Ross was 33 playing a 24-year-old, and even that age change from the teenage Dorothy couldn't mask the miscasting. Original director John Badham had quit over Ross landing the role instead of Stephanie Mills, who'd starred on Broadway. Critics and audiences both struggled with Ross in the part. The film's pacing dragged despite spectacular production numbers. At over 2 hours, it felt bloated and unfocused. Most devastatingly, theater chains in white neighborhoods refused to book The Wiz, fearing it would scare off their regular customers. This casual discrimination, combined with genuinely mixed critical reception, meant the film was fighting an uphill battle from day one. The Wiz opened in October 1978 and immediately struggled. it made approximately 13 to 21 million domestically against that massive production budget. Once marketing costs were added, the losses were catastrophic. The failure had cultural repercussions beyond simple finances. Many industry observers blamed it for Hollywood retreating from black-led productions, arguing that if this star-studded musical couldn't succeed, nothing could. The film effectively ended Diana Ross's theatrical career and damaged careers across the production. But here's the twist. Michael Jackson's performance was universally praised. His time in New York during filming directly influenced his Off the Wall album, released 10 months later. The film also eventually found its audience, becoming a cult classic beloved by multiple generations. Today, The Wiz is recognized as culturally significant, even if it was a complete disaster in 1978. 1978 taught Hollywood brutal lessons about gambling big and losing bigger. These 13 disasters share common threads: miscasting, bad timing, tired genres, and fundamental misunderstanding of what audiences wanted. Some, like Days of Heaven and The Wiz, would later be re-evaluated as important works. Others, like Moment by Moment and Sgt. Pepper's, remain cautionary tales of excess and ego. Together, they represent hundreds of millions in losses and countless damaged careers. But here's what makes them fascinating. Box office failure doesn't always equal artistic failure, and commercial success doesn't guarantee lasting impact. These disasters shaped Hollywood's more conservative approach in the 80s, proving that even the biggest stars and most respected directors can create expensive mistakes. The industry learned, audiences moved on, and cinema evolved. These 13 films, for better or worse, are part of that evolution.